Yeah. So, for me, I think my process, to use that word, is really like, I'd say I could break it down probably into three parts. So there is the drafting process, there's the editing process, and there is the publication process. And in the drafting, I tried to be as messy as possible because I need to dismantle the perfectionist, right? Like a sculptor works with clay and they're given the clay that they then are shaping and shaping. But as a writer, we have to make our own clay, which is like the raw materials of the words. So there's all kinds of ways that I work to dismantle my own perfectionism so that I can get enough clay that I can then begin to sculpt later in the editing process. So for me, it's like, sometimes I dictated So Sad Today using Siri and a notes app. I dictated the rough draft of that and the rough drafts of the Pisces and Milk Fed because I needed to like keep it casual and messy. And I didn't go back and look at anything that Siri had translated for me because I wanted it to just be that I had the permission to just go. You know what I'm saying? To just like push forward. So there was that element. There's other things I do to dismantle perfectionism and make it more like play, and everything from I'll use like bibliomancy or stickomancy, which is kind of using source texts and stealing words from public domain texts, like not full sentences, but like often like nouns. Yeah, there's all kinds of games and sort of ways I have to try to make that drafting process like play. And I try not to think about the audience at all. Then in the editing process, I do think a lot about lucidity and communication, and I try to divorce myself from the work. So, will divorce myself from having written the work, basically. So, what I'll do is I'll send myself PDFs of chapters using like a different font than I usually use to try to read it as though it's somebody else's ebook. Because I really want like a very cold eye. So, whereas I want like the warmest experience in the drafting process, I really want a cold clinical eye for the editing process. And then the publication process is where like any shame might come in or any fear might come in or a sort of joy at being like seen or witnessed, and a fear of being witnessed. And so I don't think I ever write from the place of like, I need to explain myself or here's going to be this like bottle, like encapsulated bottle of easy explanation for people or succinct explanation. But my husband has this neuroimmune disease that's so long. It's been a really, really long haul and it's complicated and there's a lot of unknowns about it and a lot of mystery. So it can be really exhausting when I tell people that my husband is disabled and they're like, and they ask more about it because well-meaning people want to solve it. So they'll be like, have you tried the salmon
Yeah.
and salad diet? Right? Have you tried? And I'm like, honey, we've tried everything from like really intense HIV drugs to like worm therapy, right? Like the full end from woo-woo to like really intense toxic Western medicines, like the whole gamut. So it's really handy to have that whole journey, or at least up until that point, summed up there. So I don't have to explain. But I don't think I think about that in the drafting or the editing processes.
Can you talk a little bit about like specific, it doesn't have to be even specifically that one, but I reread it yesterday and I can just imagine if I was you having something like you said, difficult to explain. And you've talked about this before too. I feel like you will understand this feeling of trying to, I over talk and I over try to explain myself to want to be understood or to just perhaps sometimes to connect, but in writing it's almost like be able to, you can't really necessarily say everything and obviously so eloquently, and but just even the time in a conversation with someone or when someone like you said is well meaning and you don't want to come off, or you're just trying to move the conversation forward. How did it feel when you did publish that? Like, can you talk about that relieving feeling, and have you had it since with other works?
Well, so like for those at home, the title of the essay is "I Told You Not to Get the Knish: Thoughts on Open Marriage and Illness," and you can Google it, and it's online. And that essay wasn't particularly difficult for me to publish because it was sort of in the shadow of another essay in the So Sad Today book, which is an essay about a vomit fetish. And that essay to this day haunts me. Basically, like when I wrote that essay, and it's probably like the most like frightening thing for me to ever publish because it's like so just like if we are matryoshka dolls like of our former selves, then like that is like really like one of the littlest like baby for me like matryoshka dolls inside. And so and when I included it in the So Sad Today book, my editor and agent were like, "Are you sure you want to publish this?" I was like, "Absolutely." And then we got like a lot closer to publication. I was like, "You know what? I kind of want to pull the essay." And they were like, "It's too late. It's already." And so whenever like my Aunt Judy, like my 80-year-old Aunt Judy, or like my former boss Craig is like, "I read So Sad Today," I always immediately go to that essay and like a hit of shame.
Does it feel good? And, people talk about like using writing to understand what you're thinking. Do you feel like that is something that happens for you? And do you feel like you are more understood when people have spent time? Are either of those things goals of yours when you're writing generally?
I think my writing like largely comes from this place of like survival and like feeling compelled. But I will say that writing is often extremely edifying. And like even sometimes when I look back and read something that I wrote like years ago, I'm like, "Oh, I felt the same way then." Like, and there's a sense of
Yeah.
being like I'm very much of the my friend and I have a joke like no new problems, and like there is in a way like yes there's something I guess that could be seen as frustrating about having the same sort of like thematic obsessions slash problems, or struggles, let's say, that one has had their whole life. But I find something very relieving about it. And I'm like, "Oh, I am the same person. Like, this is not new." And there's a relief in that because I'm like, I survived that then. And so I think like, yes, there are all kinds of ways that writing can be edifying, like about the self and looking back on one's own work. But a lot of times, like I'll read something and I'm like, "I wrote that." Not that I don't recognize like the themes, but just I'll be like, I almost like don't remember writing it in some strange way. Or like, especially if I read something and I think it's still holds up, like I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty good." I'm like, "Wow, I wasn't so bad." So it can be a really interesting way of relating to the self to look back and look at one's own work and see like the themes that were there are still, even though there is evolution and there are different themes too, and different, like, as you said, eras or phases, it's the same as like if I read all of like some of my favorite writers like Marguerite Duras, or if I read all of Thomas Bernhard, like each of their books are different, but like Marguerite Duras, like I'll see the same themes over and over, and like love, longing, limerence, right? Like they appear in, like, I don't know that there's any Marguerite Duras book that doesn't include some love, longing, limerence. Thomas Bernhard, the absurdity of existence, rants, right? So like a really powerful mind and a stream of consciousness in the brain. Clarice Lispector, also the absurdity of existence. I tend to be drawn to writers who are looking at the absurdity of existence. And so I think that often as writers, like we can write entirely different books, and yet like there is a lot of continuity. Philip Roth, sex, Judaism, right? Belonging versus isolation. So I think that yeah, it's there's a relief in that and seeing like, "Oh, I do have some kind of core self."